Good afternoon. My name is John Schmitz. I'm the archivist and historian for the Chautauqua Institution, and I wish to welcome you to this afternoon's Heritage Lecture on Horace Greeley. Today's speaker is Doug Neckers. He is the McMaster Distinguished Research Professor Emeritus and founder of the Center for Photochemical Sciences at Bowling Green State University. He was the past chair of the board for the Robert Jackson Center and is currently the CEO of Spectra Group Limited, as Spectra, not Spectrum. He's author of many books and papers, including an article on Horace Greeley that appears in the summer edition of the Western New York Heritage magazine, which is on sale at the bookstore. I see he has some copies here as well. So please welcome Professor Doug Neckers.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Dealing with Horace Greeley at Chautauqua on a beautiful summer day is a real challenge. And when you find out the Hall of Philosophy doesn't have projection capabilities, well, you go to the Hall of Christ. So that's why we're here, and I'm glad to see so many of you that have come. Horace Greeley has a local connection. His family moved in 1826 from New England to just south of Clymer, New York, which is where I'm sure there's some Clymer people here. My co-author and I are from Clymer originally, and lived there for the remainder of their lives. The property is still in the hands of subsequent Greeley family people. So it looks the same as it did in 1826, I must say, out in the country, across the Pennsylvania line, south of Clymer, 3 miles. So I got fascinated by Horace Greeley because he had a connection with the Robert Jackson Center. In the Robert Jackson Center, if you haven't been there, well, there are plenty of Jackson Center people here, so please take advantage of learning from them what the Jackson Center is all about. Jackson was a native of this part of the country as well. Greeley was not necessarily a native, but his family became natives, and Greeley moved here himself in 1830. Now, recognize 1830 is only 4 years after the beginning of the Erie Canal, and the family lived in East Pulteney, Vermont, which is on Lake Champlain. So the family and Horace himself got from East Pulteney, Vermont to south of Clymer, New York, taking first of all the Lake Champlain Canal down to Troy, New York, and then across the Erie Canal to Buffalo. And Buffalo, Horace himself took a ferry boat from Buffalo to Dunkirk and then walked from Dunkirk to Clymer, which is about 50 miles over hill. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a little while. The family which came earlier did the same trek, but they took they hired a wagon from Buffalo, and the wagon took them to northeast Pennsylvania. And northeast is just exactly north of the property that they eventually landed on. Turned out that Zacchaeus Greeley had purchased the property before he brought his family here. And the property was just about directly south of northeast. So they took then an ox cart up over the hills. And if you want to have a friendly trek, go to Wattsburg and try and get to the Pennsylvania line in the south today. Think nothing about what it was when there were no roads, no real good ways to be marking those roads, and doing it at night, as Horace Greeley did. So I got fascinated, and so did my co-author, Judy Camp, whose background is quite different than mine. She is a nurse living in Tampa, Florida, but we were high school classmates in Clymer in a class of 25 people. And when the lockdown happened, I remembered that her family home was 2 miles east of the Greeley property on the State Line Road. We began to try and figure out who the heck this guy Greeley really was. Well, in the end, we've come away totally fascinated by a human being that probably has gotten more attention from political cartoonists than anybody except perhaps Donald Trump in the history of political cartoons. And part of the fact is that the political cartoons don't do him the good grace that he probably should have had. But he was a brilliant man, self-taught, came from nothing like Abraham Lincoln, of the same age, taught himself to read at the same time. And if you stop and think about it, three people that I can think of were born in exactly the same time frame. Horace Greeley in 1811, Abraham Lincoln in 1809, and Felix Mendelssohn in 1809, all three of whom were incredible geniuses, carried their words forward and their music forward for humankind going forward. So if you want to be famous, you need to do what Greeley did, and that's write copiously. All he did was write. He started a paper. The first paper in New York City, which was the New York Tribune, was Greeley's paper, and it became the most successful paper in the United States by the beginning of the Civil War. He had 600,000 subscribers in 1860, and it was said by Harper's Magazine that there were two famous Americans, Greeley and Abraham Lincoln. So he was a self-made man. He was precocious. Precocious meaning he taught himself to read from the Bible when he was 4 years old. He was hired out to a printer in East Poultney, Vermont as an apprentice, and worked as a printer's apprentice for the next decade or so, about 8 years, not 10, until his family moved. And at that point, he carried with him the skills of a printer and came here to be with his family for a few months. He found a job with what became, according to Christy Herbst, who was the former editor of the Jamestown Now Post Journal, said that he worked for the Jamestown Post. I doubt it, because they didn't pay him, so he quit. But anyway, he also worked for a paper in Erie, the Erie Gazette, and that was his last job, which he also quit or was fired or somehow disconnected from the Erie Gazette, the owner of which was a man by the name of Joseph Sterrett, who was famous in Pennsylvania politics. And after the Erie job, he had enough money to pay off his father. Remember, well, maybe you don't even know this, but at that point, the age of 21 was the age of maturity. Until you were 21, you worked for your father. Lincoln did, so did Greeley. He paid off his father and took $25 and went to New York City to see what his future was going to be, and that was 1831. Well, he was the victim, as was of many of people at that time, of Thomas Nast, the editorial cartoonist who just made a nuisance of himself. So on the left is Greeley looking at himself in a mirror, in German, Spiegel im Spiegel, mirror in a mirror. So he's looking at himself and seeing what he sees. On the right is Lincoln trying to fix the Union with glue. And in the middle is what Nast also created, the donkey for Democrats and the elephant for Republicans. This happens to be something that appeared in 1880, long after both Lincoln and Greeley were dead. But this is talking about the fights between those political parties. What is it, 1880 from now, 142 years ago? Nothing's changed. Historical Greeley. Now I got to look at my notes a little bit. Greeley stood for freedom, so he wanted to have the chance to, he wanted people that were slaves to be free rather than just freed, so that they could develop their own estates, develop their own activities, develop their own businesses. And he was a great Lincoln fan, a great Lincoln supporter. The story goes that when the Lincoln train, which many of you have heard about, which went from Springfield, Illinois, through Baltimore at night to Washington, came through this area, Greeley got on the train at Girard, Pennsylvania, the home of Jared Jacobson, the former late organist here at Chautauqua, and rode to Erie on the train with Lincoln. Then he got off, went farther east, and got on the train again east to Buffalo, and was on the train for a few miles after that. And the story goes, at least from the point of view of his biographers, that probably what happened during that time was that Lincoln convinced him that war was going to be necessary. We weren't going to save the Union without a war with the South, and that was going to be coming. And from that point on, the Tribune became very strong in the idea that the Civil War was pretty obvious and going to happen pretty quickly. And it did, of course, as soon as Lincoln was inaugurated with the Fort Sumter thing in April of 1861. Now, Greeley was tied to he founded the New York Tribune in 1841, was first newspaper of any consequence in New York City. Henry Raymond, who was the first editor of the New York Times, worked for Greeley, as did several other very famous authors. Henry Thoreau published Walden first in the New York Tribune. Ralph Waldo Emerson worked for Greeley. Karl Marx worked for Greeley. Marx and Engels published about 2,500 pieces in the New York Tribune and other English-speaking organs here in the United States, as much driven by Greeley's interactions with them and interest in them as anything. Edgar Allan Poe borrowed $50 from Greeley and never paid him back, as you might imagine. Dickens came to New York, was hosted by the New York people in Greeley's shop, and also often wrote for the Tribune and published in the Tribune in the United States. Greeley and other publishers in New York City took after Tammany Hall, and this is what Thomas Nast thinks on the left of Greeley and the publisher of the Herald dealing with Tammany Hall. And in his office, Greeley was not a man of great, well, he wasn't Beau Brummel, let's put it that way. He had a white coat and he had a white hat, and that was basically it. The white coat was given to him by the printer in East Pulteney when he was 14 years old, and for all we knew, he wore it for most of the rest of his life. And he was a workaholic. He was at the Tribune all the time. And this is just Thomas Nast, who was the man that made everybody miserable. Greeley, in some unique ways, ended up being a candidate for the presidency in 1872. So 1872, Lincoln elected 1860, so 12 years after the election of Abraham Lincoln, after the nomination of Abraham Lincoln, Greeley himself is nominated, and he's nominated, get this, as a candidate for the presidency from the Liberal Republican Party. Liberal Republican, does that compute? Here, this is all Democrats at Chautauqua anyway, but anyway, so Liberal Republican. Well, he was the only guy of choice. He was the only one left. So he became the candidate, and Grant said if it hadn't been for Thomas Nast's cartoons, Grant would have lost the election of 1872, because Nast just took after Greeley and pillared him every chance he got. So he became the whipping boy for the first political cartoonist. Now, in this case, he also got after the Chinese at the top. You can see him dealing with the Chinese in San Francisco. And at the bottom, he's talking to P.T. Barnum about what to do about all of this. So he had great friends and great connections. Here's the emerging press, the idea of the Tribune. The Tribune was an organization that didn't take any prisoners. So they were very happy, not happy, but they did political evaluations and made political comments and made political statements that may not have necessarily been popular with the people that were running for office. Greeley was a strong supporter and friend of Lincoln. They met in 1848 when they were both in the House. Lincoln having been elected from Illinois, Greeley having been appointed for 2 months, filling out a term by a representative who died, but he did not then run for re-election. But that's how he met Lincoln. They stayed together through the 1850s, and of course these were the years that there was great significant urging, I don't know what the right word is at this point, for new states to come into the Union to have the opportunity to either be slave states or free states. So this is Kansas, Nebraska, and all those compromises that occurred at that time. And that was what Lincoln said, and what Lincoln posed as the most important thing that he could do was to keep the slave owners out of the new states that were coming into the Union at that time. And if we have anything to thank Greeley and Lincoln for, it's exactly that. Missouri, partially a slave state. I went to the University of Kansas, and the tensions between Kansas over and Missouri in the 1960s, or the questions of slaves in the 1860s, were still extant. I can remember a fight on the basketball floor was totally over that in about 1963. So Kansas became, quote, a free state, unquote, but Kansas also became the place where Brown versus Board got its start. So it was a time of great tension, but what Lincoln and Greeley and others managed to do was to keep those states from being slave states. And you can look west of the Mississippi, and it's about the case for all of them. Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, south Texas, Oklahoma, all those states. Some of them did in fact have slave owners in the states, but most of them, New Mexico, Arizona, were not slave states. And that's really what Lincoln and Greeley accomplished. Now, Greeley managed to help support Lincoln at the convention of 1860. So this is the beginning of the Republican Party. It's hard to know exactly what the exact date of the beginning of the Republican Party is, but it's from 1856, 1857, 1858, in that time frame sometime. So there was a meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin, that was 1854, in which people talked about being dissatisfied with the way the Whig Party was dealing with most anything. The Whig Party had allowed presidents who were very undistinguished, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, James Buchanan, to be elected, totally undistinguished people. And things were changing fast enough so that there were a bunch of uneasy people in the Whig Party, Greeley and Lincoln being two, who wanted to see some changes. So the Ripon, Wisconsin meeting of about 50 people. Subsequent to that, there was a meeting in Mayville, New York. Mayville, New York, hosted by the editor at that time of the Westfield Republican, whose name was Martin Rice. Gathered Henry Raymond, and who was the New York Times, Greeley, Robert Patterson, don't remember who else, together in Mayville to talk about forming a new party, forming what's going on now in some ways, which probably isn't going to be successful. But in 1860 it was. So this was the new Republican Party, and Greeley and Lincoln were right square in the middle, and the actual date of formation, probably 1857 in Pittsburgh. So their first candidate for president really was Lincoln, and that was 1860, but he didn't win that nomination easily. The convention in 1860 was in Chicago. It was held in June, I think, and it was held at a time that was cut so short that the convention delegates from Oregon on the West Coast, which was the only West Coast state that was part of the Union at the time, couldn't get to Chicago. So Greeley, in his inimitable way, got the credentials from one of the Oregon delegates and ended up on the floor of the convention in 1860, and more or less was the leader on what became Lincoln's team on the convention floor. And Lincoln's nomination, in large measure, was due to Greeley's efforts on his behalf, never forgotten. So Greeley, strong supporter of Lincoln, and then he had felt every sense of entitlement to be able to tell Lincoln he was doing things wrong, and he did this throughout his tenure. Now, Greeley had a genius, and that genius was he selected the greatest people to be his editorial staff that he could possibly find. Greeley's the third on the right, the bald-haired guy, and in the back right behind him is Charles Dana, Charles Dana was likely the most significant editor in any that did not own a newspaper in that period of anyone. This picture was taken by Matthew Brady, Matthew Brady, the Civil War photographer, and that's another characteristic of Greeley. He used technology at every chance he got. So he had representatives for his paper in London, representatives in Washington, representatives in San Francisco, and he managed with the telegraph, which was brand new at that time, to get information back from these places and get it into his newspaper. So he used the technology that was available as to his ability, and doing that, he was able to outstrip the other newspapers in New York. So a lot of things that happened that were New York news came to the people through Greeley. Now, this was at a time when there was a huge number of immigrants coming to the United States. The Germans, in large measure, immigrated after 1848. So there were a large number of Germans, a large number of Irish coming, later Italians, and others that came to New York, and they got their education through Horace Greeley's newspaper, which he sold for a couple cents a copy, published it every day, had it out into the rural sections around New York City, and basically was the pipeline of information that got to the people in the area. And when he died in 1872, there were huge celebrations, the wrong word, memorializations in the New York City area in honor of this man who was so widely known, a newspaper editor. Can you imagine today what would happen if the New York Times editor died in New York City? Would there be any celebration at all? I don't know, maybe, but you get the picture. Well, here's Thomas Nast. This guy was a nasty guy, but he also started drawing the first picture of Santa Claus. So there are a lot of pictures of Santa Claus drawn by Nast, this one on the right, but he just took after Greeley unmercifully. Greeley was an easy guy to take after, and there he is on the left, and a little statement at the bottom, which I won't bother to read. But people were, Greeley was treated not nicely by the community in which he lived. And then, of course, he wanted to be a politician, too, and nobody wanted him to be a politician. So if you want to be a politician, nobody else wants you to be a politician. Guess what? You ain't a politician. And that was Greeley's problem, too. So Greeley ran for president. So 1872, this liberal Republican Party decides that it's going to take on Grant because there were some things in the Grant administration that were really untoward. One of the things that was untoward was civil service was a real pot of iniquity in that time. And a senator from New York State, whose name I'm sure some of you will know, Roscoe Conkling, was the rascal of the Senate at the time. And Conkling had his hands in the New York Customs Office. So he didn't want civil service reform because if it was reformed, then he was going to lose money from every ship that came to New York that paid customs, paid Conkling. And among the people that worked for him at that time, well, Chester Alan Arthur, who was a president a few years later. So it was all sort of corrected and connected and untoward, at that point. So this group of liberal Republicans that includes Greeley, but also includes a very famous name from Jamestown, who I would argue is one of the top 5 governors that the entire state of New York has ever had, Reuben Fenton, was also very much in this activity. Fenton was very much opposed to Grant, very much opposed to what he was doing with respect to his leadership. They were also very much opposed to what was happening in the South. And so all these partners, including also Pulitzer, Joseph Pulitzer, who was the editor of a newspaper in St. Louis, the man of the Pulitzer Prize, was part of this liberal Republican group. And so they didn't have anybody else to pick. And so they ended up with Greeley. Now, Greeley ran in 1872. He lost the election. He campaigned here. He campaigned in Corey, Pennsylvania, campaigned in Erie. He made amends in Erie with the people. He didn't say so many bad things about Erie when he was there as a presidential candidate as he did when he was a kid trying to work for the local newspaper. But he was very very much appreciated at that time. I don't see Tom Hagen here, but we've had long discussions about what Greeley said about Erie back in the old days. And the answer was that when he was a candidate for president, he said many nice things. Now, Greeley did something else. He runs for president on November 3, and it turns out that his wife is very ill, and he loses his wife. And 3 weeks after the election, Greeley dies. Only presidential candidate in history to die before the Electoral College meets. Does that give you any ideas as we go forward or backward? Oh, I shouldn't have said that. I mean, but I'm among friends, I think, right? Now, I have to tell you another story. And this story is really it has a Jackson Center connection too, because when I'm around the Jackson Center, I talk to the old guys. I don't talk to the kids, but I talk to the older guys, right? And they tell me what it was really like before the Jackson Center showed up. And I see Kristen and Greg in the front row, so I can go ahead and tell these stories. But anyway, one of them was telling me not too long ago that they never heard a thing about Robert Jackson when they were in high school. Well, I can go them one more. I went to Clymer Central School with 25 other students in my senior class, Judy being one of them. Greeley's family was buried 100 yards across the street in the Clymer Cemetery, and I never heard a thing about Greeley when I was a student. Oh, I learned a lot about Ichabod Crane and Washington Irving. James Fenimore Cooper also worked for Greeley, heard a lot about him, but nothing about anything about in the neighborhood, right? And I talked to people that went to school in Pennsylvania, had the same story. The local stuff doesn't get to the kids because the local teachers are not in the schools, right? Well, there's a picture of Necker's Company, and I thought seriously about leaving it out because when I took some of these over there to leave the other day, they said, oh, we don't want that kind of stuff in our store. So I thought I'd put my own grandfather's store in, but it was too much work. But Necker's Company in Clymer, and the Clymer restaurant, which some of you probably had this stuff on the right, and the first house in Clymer in 1823. First house in Clymer was built by a guy by the name of Gardner Cleveland, and as I talked to the owner of that property, there's still some beams in that property that go back to at least before the Civil War. So right now it's got the Dutch took over, so it's got a windmill in its front yard, but it really belongs to those guys that moved from the East Coast, many of whom, around here particularly, were Revolutionary War veterans who were not paid for their service. So there are 5 Revolutionary War veterans in the cemetery in Clymer, and if you look at any of the small cemeteries around here, Westfield, Bemis Point, you'll find Revolutionary War soldiers in all of them because they didn't get paid. Well, here's the Clymer Cemetery. And this is a picture, it's a very inconspicuous kind of place. It looks straight south as we're seeing it. This is a springtime picture. And Horace Greeley bought 12 lots in that cemetery in 1860 when the cemetery was set up. Now, for all you lawyers here, there were big contests about the Greeley will. 2 of the children really were quite concerned that the property in western Pennsylvania, which belonged to the family, should go to them rather than to the brothers. Well, the property wasn't good for much, and finally, after 4 successive years, they gave up, and the brothers actually then owned the property. Now, to all you lawyers, 12 cemetery lots in the Clymer Cemetery, they're still listed as being owned by Horace Greeley. Who owns those plots? Is it a question? There has to be a law, right? Anyway, so pictures for going south, looking toward Pennsylvania, and the little hills there are basically where the Greeley family settled. Here are the markers for Greeley's parents in the cemetery. Mother died 1855, father died 1866, buried next to one another along with several other relatives. Picture below is a picture taken by Matthew Brady, found by Robert Williams, who is really the most significant Greeley biographer, Professor at Davidson College. Mary Woodburn being Her family was Irish, the Greeleys were English and older than had come to the United States before the Greeleys had. So the Woodburns came after the Greeleys did, and so it was always thought that the kids that took after the mother that were smarter than the kids that took after the dad. And that's said in some of the things that have been written. One sister married John Cleveland, who was the grandson of the founder of Clymer, and he worked for a number of years for Horace Greeley at the Tribune in New York. And in fact, John Cleveland wrote the campaign slogans and things of that sort for Lincoln in the 1860 election. Now here's just a little bit of a picture of what Greeley did when he came here. So this is a picture of Chautauqua County. This may in fact be in the Western New York Heritage, but you can see Dunkirk on the lake, and we'll just show some pictures later on, walking across to the south to the border across in the Pennsylvania border. So he went from Dunkirk to Fredonia to Mayville, past the end of Chautauqua Lake. He doesn't comment. He wrote a huge autobiography. So there are 5 paragraphs on this walk in his autobiography. Doesn't say if there are weeds in Chautauqua Lake or not, but maybe nobody asked him. I guess Chautauqua Institution wasn't there at the time taking care of those weeds. Anyway, so he went from Mayville to Mina Sherman, and from Mina across to Clymer, and from Clymer 3 miles south up Spirit Hill, significant name, into the Pennsylvania woods, basically. Well, here's a picture of Dunkirk's port today. How many ships come from Buffalo, ferries come from Buffalo every week to deliver passengers to the Dunkirk port? Anybody want to guess? None. There's no service. Why? Because the lake is so rough. Now, couldn't you think that somebody might live in Dunkirk and work in Buffalo? Too hard because the lake is so rough. Now, here are 3 pictures. You've all seen the peacock thing in Mayville. You've driven by it. On the top right is a picture of SUNY Fredonia, and at the bottom is the State Line Road, which is on Route 394 in Clymer. This is what the Greeley property looks like today, only this is really a better part of the Greeley property. This is where Greeley's Walk ended. Still a dirt road, still property on the left side, as you see the picture, that belongs in the sequence of Greeley. It doesn't belong to the Greeley family anymore, but the deeds show Greeley's. And then on the right, basically just woods. So that property's basically never been developed. Well, Judy, who was from the area, 2 miles down the road, didn't know anything about the Greeleys. There was no history. But the Greeley's family was still in some ways involved when we were high school kids. Greeley had a relative who was the postmaster at Chautauqua Institution from 1918 to 1923. Now, what happened between 1918 and 1921? Wilson out of office. Who came? Another Democrat? Nope. So that poor Greeley guy was there while Wilson, the Democrat, was the president. So who is it? Harding that comes along next. Harding comes along, and out goes the Democrat, and then comes another Republican. And if you go look at the wall of the post office here in Chautauqua, you'll see when that changed about 1922. Liberal Republicans, who were they? Well, these were guys that believed this is their platform. I have to get my glasses on, sorry. So they believed that all men were created equal. Sort of Thomas Jefferson said that. They believed the Union should be maintained, should be resurrected, and they wanted to release rebel prisoners. Greeley and seven others, including a Vanderbilt, paid $10,000 apiece for Jefferson Davis's bail. Cost Greeley enormously politically, but he paid, along with others, Jefferson Davis bail. So they're talking in 1872, the war's over. Remove the troops. So stop Reconstruction, basically. local governments should become the insurers of equity and equality in those southern states. Did they? Not so well. Civil service reform, no more large corporation grants, fair taxation, and this flew in the face of Roscoe Conkling, who was a real strong man in the Senate. Only guy ever to turn down twice appointments to the Supreme Court, one to be Chief Justice, Conkling. And they also wanted to have much more intercourse with foreign nations, promote friendship, promote peace. Now, this is a picture of the Cincinnati Convention, and this is the one at which Greeley was nominated. Now, this wasn't chopped liver. This was a huge group of people that gathered in Cincinnati dissatisfied with the government of the United States. And as I said, Fenton, Greeley, Salmon Chase, who was a banker from Ohio, and Joseph Pulitzer, who went to New York eventually, but who was the editor of the newspaper in St. Louis. And Greeley came out as the nominee. Now, let's fast forward. Greeley loses. He goes away because he dies, and things go forward from this point. Well, one of the things that I've really enjoyed is getting to know entrepreneurs from the old days. Greeley was a heck of an entrepreneur. He made something out of nothing. Lincoln made something out of nothing. And John Hyle Vincent here made something out of nothing. Now, John Hyle Vincent was a bishop in the Methodist Church, but before that he was a parson. And he was a parson in a church in Galena, Illinois. Anybody know where Galena is? Good. Anybody know what the word Galena means? What? Keep going. Lead. That's right. So Galena is one of the ores of lead. I'm an organic chemist. I can't think about metals. Anyway, so Galena, Illinois. Now, U.S. Grant, the president, was a member of that congregation, not a particularly good one, but his father was. Okay? So Grant's father was an active member of the Methodist Church in Galena, Illinois. Now, I'm not sure how John Hyle Vincent, and you may know John, I don't, but I'm not sure how John Hyle Vincent got to Akron from Galena, Illinois, but he did. So he was the bishop in Akron and started Chautauqua Institution, as we heard over and over again right now, in 1874, right? Now, John Hyle Vincent was a capital entrepreneur, and what could you do better than to get somebody to bless your organization if that somebody was the President of the United States? So there's a book that was written by a Methodist member of the Methodist Church in Jamestown that tells the entire story about how the Methodist bishop in Meadville, which is what the Methodist churches here in this area are controlled by, works together to get a letter from Vincent to be carried to Grant or Grant's people to try and invite Grant to come to Chautauqua Institution to give this place its blessing. Entrepreneur Vincent gets President Grant to Chautauqua using the Bishop of Meadville on August 14th, 1875. What other very important thing happened on the 14th of August in Chautauqua history? Somebody must know. John? How about Roosevelt's speech, "I Hate War," in 1936? Same date, right? Why do I know that? Because my birthday is the next day. Anyway, so the Methodist Church and the $50 bill are two reminders of who Grant was. Now, Greeley dies, and this is what Mr. Nast says about Greeley. His own words and deeds buried him. But at his funeral, the people weren't so sure. So he, by the way, was a spiritualist. So his thoughts about talking to the seven children that he lost before they could go beyond about their second year was to bring up their spirits. And he and his wife were both active spiritualists. But Henry Ward Beecher, who was a minister with whom he worked, said he died, and the hard judgment of him died with him. Harriet Beecher Stowe, writing of Uncle Tom Cabin, said, he had many weaknesses, but it covers a lot of strength, real kindness and benevolence, for which the world is far better off. That's Greeley. The entire cabinet, led by Grant, Schuyler Colfax, who was at that time, now this is the end of 1872, still the vice president. Colfax was replaced by Harry Wilson in the next 4 years, and that was incredibly significant with the election of 1876, which was, after all, Hayes-Tilden, right? Hayes-Tilden. 1876, there was no vice president because Wilson died. Cabinet, Grant, and all the other Washington dignitaries, the Senate closed to come to Greeley's funeral. Well, let's go back to getting Grant to Chautauqua. So Grant, by this time, by the way, I told you that Greeley walked from Dunkirk to Clymer. 1862 was the beginning of the Transcontinental Railroad. Greeley himself had made it to the West Coast in 1859. No railroad. Got to San Francisco, made some very salient and important comments about how wonderful it was that his country had discovered the Pacific Ocean, how wonderful a place that was. But to get back, what did he do? He took a boat to Panama and walked the Isthmus of Panama. There was no Panama Canal. And he has some delightful things in his autobiography to say about going through the Panama Canal when there's no canal boats, no canal. Anyway, so getting Grant from Jamestown, he got there by train. How do you get him to Chautauqua? Well, here's a picture of the city of Jamestown. How many remember the city of Jamestown? I see 3 hands. There are probably more. Greg, you must remember the city of Jamestown. Right, okay. But what I forget, he comes from Washington with his whole entourage, and they got to have lunch. Now, if you're a good political handler, the last person in the world you want to have lunch with is the strongest guy that supported your opponent. And that was Reuben Fenton, who I would argue was one of the 5 most effective, I've probably said this before, governors in the history of the state of New York from Jamestown. So Fenton's house was logical, but he was persona non grata with Grant's handlers. So Fenton you can't go to Fenton's house for lunch. Where can you go? And so there are a whole bunch of stories in that same book about chasing around Jamestown and finding a place. Now, Jackson wasn't there at the time, or he'd come to the rescue. He was a little bit younger. So this is the 1875 house of Jamestown banker Alonzo Kent. Anybody that's in the audience that's been to the Jackson Center will recognize it as the Jackson Center today. The Methodist Bishop of Meadville, in cahoots with Grant's operatives, found it okay for Grant to have lunch at Kent's house if Fenton wasn't invited. But Fenton, Sikergo, snuck in the back anyway. So Grant then christens the Grant Room at Fenton's house, at Kent's house in the Jackson Center today. Politics, christened the Grant Room. Vincent wanted notice for Chautauqua Institution. They knew that was Grant, and he got the Methodist bishop in Akron. He was Methodist bishop in Akron, and so he worked with the guy in Meadville, and out of that came the Grant visit to Chautauqua Institution. Now this is a picture of Fenton and Vincent and some others, $50 bill. I like that one, so I put them on a lot. Now here's the Grant Room a few years later. A few folks you might recognize. Who's the woman on the left? How many remember Juanita Batten? Okay, who's the woman in the middle? Still alive, Sandra Day O'Connor. And E. Barrett Prettyman, Jackson's last law clerk, is on the right. Now, he wasn't eating very much that day, apparently. But what they were talking about was he considered himself Sandra Day O'Connor's movie advisor. And he'd advised her to see Silence of the Lambs, I think it was called. And unfortunately, his job was taken away. He was fired, and that's what they were talking about, was why he sent her to see Silence of the Lambs. Anyway, so why did I get after Greeley? Well, Greeley, he was from my hometown, Jackson, all that stuff had just connected. Now this is a really interesting Thomas Nast cartoon that's in the Lincoln Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And it shows Greeley hauling Lincoln into the lunatic asylum, which is the White House, followed by all of these people whose names I can't read it. Judy and I have looked at it very carefully. We don't know who all those hangers-on are, but they were ne'er-do-wells that followed Lincoln into the White House. And so this is sort of the connection of what happened with with Greeley and Grant, which ended up connecting to the Jackson Center. I want to point out a couple of other things. So about a month ago, a friend of mine and I took a trip from Dunkirk to Spirit Hill, south of Clymer. And we stopped at all these spots where we thought maybe Greeley might have stopped 120 years earlier. And we found this, and this is just a gorgeous picture actually, of the tomb of Ebenezer Skelly. Ebenezer Skelly was a Civil War veteran, and he was awarded the National Medal of Honor for his behavior in the battles of Virginia in 1864. Now, it turns out my wife's great-grandfather and my great-grandfather were both in company, well, they were in the 112th Regiment. My great-father was in Company D, as was Skelly. My great-grandfather was captured in Virginia and spent 9 months in Libby prison. But this is a picture of this inconspicuous grave of this Medal of Honor winner in the Mina Cemetery, which is, if I had to tell you how to get there, I couldn't do it, I don't think. You just follow your nose out of Sherman, and sometimes your nose leads to the Mina Cemetery. And that's what happened here. So, in any event, this is just an example of how, little things like following Greeley's path lead down some pathways that maybe will tell you some things about people you didn't really know. Now, Greeley saw liberty. He really wanted liberty for the people. He was not really an abolitionist. He really didn't say that he wanted to abolish all slavery, but he stood for freedom. He wanted people to have a chance to make their own estate. But for reasons that were really pretty significant, he and his wife experimented with communal living. And the communal living, which led to Greeley, Colorado, for example, was the spiritualist take that presumably let Molly Greeley and Horace Greeley communicate with all their dead children. They lost so many children when they were young. Now, one thing I also want to point out is that the very thing that Greeley stood for, the press, and he worked very hard to have freedom of the press, didn't do him any good. In other words, he was beaten up pretty badly by the very press that he stood for its freedom. He and Lincoln came to an agreement in 1863 after the Battle of Gettysburg that the press would not criticize the government while it was executing the war. In other words, he felt, and he agreed with Lincoln, that it was battle-wise to not get involved in some critical ways so that would hurt the troops. And so that was a big issue that came. Freedom of the press was important, but when it came to war and peace, freedom of the press had a significant thing to take back a little bit on. Now, Greeley even made the dock at Nuremberg. Now, if you're a Jackson Center type, the thing you worry about first is Jackson, and then you worry about Jackson at Nuremberg. How did Greeley make the dock at Nuremberg? Well, I told you about all these Germans that came to the United States in the 1840s and 50s after 1848. There was no real German country, actually. Germany was 1871 out of von Bismarck. But in that time, there were all sorts of small units, and so many Germans immigrated to the United States. And some of the Germans that immigrated was the family of Horace Greeley von Schacht. Von Schacht was Hitler's banker. He was in the dock at Nuremberg. He was not convicted because he was out of government before 1936. And the rules at Nuremberg was that the only people that would be tried for crimes of various kinds were those that were in government when Germany began World War II, which was 1939. Now, as an organic chemist, I can tell you that von Schacht had a relative who was a very famous professor of organic chemistry, first at Yale and later at Harvard. His name was William von Eggers Düring. Düring's mother, von Eggers, Schacht's mother and Düring's mother were related. They were direct related. So that professor at Yale, who I knew reasonably well, wrote substantially about his own disclaiming of his own relatives in 1945 after the war was over. Von Schacht was let off. I don't know what happened to him the rest of his life, but he was not convicted of anything at Nuremberg. Horace Greeley left a multi-volume autobiography. Why do we study history? Well, when you study history, you meet people. When you meet people, you find out their foibles. When you find out their foibles, you find out their strengths. Greeley was an extremely strong man. He had a lot of weaknesses, but he had a good heart, and he made that good heart work for others. And so he sets the scene to let us think about what it might have been like to be in the shoes of a guy that had to walk to get to his parents' house from Dunkirk, south of Clymer, and who continued his life being that strong, strong man, that what shaped his life afterwards became important to the United States. Now, he took some big hits. The Tribune supported Lincoln, and in 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln and the government instituted the draft. This was not a happy occasion. There were draft riots. I talked to one of the students who set up this audio and video this afternoon. He lives in Ossining, New York. He had friends that went to Horace Greeley High School in Chautauqua, New York. Chautauqua is where the Greeley's farm was when he was president or chairman of the board or whatever, editor of the New York Tribune. On the occasion of these draft riots, soldiers came back from Gettysburg and sprayed powder around his house so that his wife and family would be protected if some of the rioters came out to see them. And so, as a matter of fact, they got away and they were saved, but Greeley took big hits, and it turned out the Tribune lost a lot of subscribers as a result of his support for the war at that time. My great-grandfather, Dunwald in the middle and the back, was paid by somebody in New York City to join Company D, Regiment 102, in 1863. And as I said, he was captured at Chapin's Farm in Virginia and went from there into the Libby prison, from which he was released in 1865. And one other relative of mine who died in the Civil War, that's this guy, John Esling, who was a member of the Esling family, the only one in Clymer with the Esling name that was a male. 5 women survived. There's no Esling in Clymer now because the only guy that was an Esling that was alive at that time was John, who was killed in the Civil War. Well, I've probably gone on too long. I probably said more than I should have. But let's stop here and maybe have some questions. And if you want to talk about the campaign of 1872 and the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, happy to do that because I spent the first 15 years of my career in Hayes Hall at Bowling Green State University. Thank you very much for coming.
I believe that anyone who knows anything about Horace Greeley knows that he said, "Go west, young man, and grow up with the country." I was wondering if you could speak about that and what was the background to that famous saying.
Yeah, the background was that he told that to Daniel Grinnell, who was working in New York City at that time. He was working at the paper. Grinnell founded what became Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. But really, what he meant was Sherman. He meant here. I mean, this is west when he was talking about it. But he did go to California. He did make it by stage, and I have a marvelous statement about what he said about the Pacific at that time, as I said. But that wasn't what he had in mind. He was talking to Grinnell. It was 1839, quite early. Thanks for the question.
Doug, you spent a lot of time on the whole Thomas Nast, Horace Greeley love affair. Do you know the genesis of why he found Greeley such a welcoming subject?
Well, there are two reasons. One is that Greeley, he had a very pleasant's not the right word. He was an ugly guy. I mean, he was just not a pretty guy. So he was easy to mock. But on top of that, there was questions about how he handled Tammany Hall, whether or not he was mean enough to Tammany Hall, which was Thurlow Weed, wasn't it? John, you and I were talking about this the other day. Weed was a Tweed, I guess, was Tammany Hall. So the question of New York politics was really what got Nast riled up. And boy, he really, I would guess there are 200 cartoons, individual cartoons, if you look for them, and most of them you can get your hands on, as you can see from the Heritage Society, where we've got several. So, but it was, if you ever want to know what the press can do, just look at this election of 1872. And then we followed that with the awful election of 1876. You know where we got trouble in 2020? Go back to Hayes-Tilden, and you'll find out why. Bob?
I'm a little confused. So Ulysses Grant in 1872 is the incumbent Republican Party president.
Right.
And Greeley is nominated by some rump liberal Republican Party or split off Republican Party?
Yeah, so there was a major split. And it was over those items of, slavery and taking care of those people that were released, those people that were allowed to become free, and basically all those questions that became the Reconstruction questions. So what happened was the liberal Republicans and the Democrats were one party, and the Republicans, which was Grant, was the other. So it was a real question of the integrity of what the composition of the Republican Party at the time was going to be. The party was only 15 years old, so it was tenuous of whether it was going to exist after that. But Greeley, had they nominated somebody, Pickett, had they nominated Fenton perhaps, the chances of winning that election would have been greater. But Greeley just didn't have the persona to carry it. But it was, he got 2 million votes. And he had 66 electoral votes, but then he died. So what do you do? Now you can go to read the Jamestown paper. The candidate dies, what do you do with the electoral votes? Yeah. And you'll find out eventually the vice president got them all.
You count some fake votes.
Yeah, well, that's been done before. Right? Thanks, good question.
Well, thanks a lot, Doug.
Thank you.